Blessings, everybody. I hope everybody's having a good day. I'm here to deliver small, bite-sized uh, preaching slash word for you all today. Um, so we can go right ahead and get started. And I apologize for the condensed nature of uh, this. I'd like to go into this in further detail, but I have to keep it short. I'd like to take us on a journey today on the fidelity of God's promise. In a sense, how strong God's promises are in the good and in the bad. We can take a look at, the severity of Old Testament violations from God's subjects, us being humans. Um, this specifically, though, is not something that we look at very closely. Often, the focus in theological discussions is often brought to the meanings and extrapolations gained from analyzing the promises of Abraham, Jacob, Noah, and other noble men of the Bible. While it's also true that in more informal theological environments, the use of fear, you know, through the illustration of God's punishment, fire and brimstone, of humanity, this is also a tactic that's used to fill up seats at church, though that's not what I'm attempting to do here today. Though you might see some similarities, I suppose. The pattern that I would like to illustrate is that God keeps his word always, but this does not exclude the consequences that we must face if we are to move away from this pact. In the same way that we run to the arms of God to embrace his promises and blessings, we should also go about the world with a very light step in our feet, so that we do not go past the rules that we have allowed God to set in place for us. Having a relationship with the Lord is a voluntary action. It is a promise kept in heaven, and while God can be forgiving and understanding of missteps, for we are only human, we must also remember that our actions on earth represent His kingdom. And whether we would like to admit it or not, the actions that we decide to take is a testimony of God's work to the rest of the world. Now, the reason I wanted to preface, this word with the idea of patterns and our representation, us being the representation of God on earth, is because I'd like to discuss the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and specifically the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and the sin over time, because it's a very interesting type of sin that we see repeated, though we don't really point it out as such. So let's begin with context. Sodom and Gomorrah, for those who don't know, it's in what is currently referred to as Syria, so modern day Syria. Part of this land of two cities of Sodom and Gomorrah is bordered by Jordan as well in the Middle East. Um, and the Bible is an important historical artifact. It confirms the locations in Genesis and Genesis 13:10, and when it says that Lot looked around and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan towards Zoar was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, this account of the destruction of the two cities is a bit farther ahead in the timeline, but it's important to understand the former location of the city, or the current location of the city. My apologies. And that is Syria and the Middle East generally. It's a tumultuous place that is plagued by war, corruption, and uncertainty. Insinuating a modern day connection to this uncertainty in the Middle East, to the sins and consequences of the past, the present. Um, that's as much as I'll cover. I'll cover right now, but I hope to elaborate more on this specifically. We can delve deeper, though, into the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, specifically as we'll see repeated again and again. Um, the sin was wasn't just in their wasn't just in their actions, not just the act of sodomy and in their reproach of human nature as is described in the Bible, but rather it was their open war against virtue and against God specifically that warranted their destruction in God's eyes. In Genesis 13:13, it says that now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. That's specific mention of the sin, but in Isaiah 3:9, we see the specific type of sin. It says, the look on their faces testifies against them. They parade their sin like Sodom. They do not hide it. Woe to them. They have brought disaster upon themselves. Um, God, in this sense, understanding these two verses, the sin and what the sin specifically entails. God understands repentance. humans are meant to commit errors, but the sin of Sodom that Isaiah mentions and that is related in Genesis 13:13, is that the sin of Sodom is not the sin of sodomy. It's not the sin of evil in the sense. It's the sin of hubris and of unrelenting evil. And that can only be corrected by God Himself. Because if you see in Isaiah 3:9, the look on their faces testifies against them. They parade their sin as opposed to feeling remorse for having committed their sin. So God destroyed the city of Sodom and Gomorrah for their wickedness, and this story was enshrined in the Bible. Lot had, I think his wife looked back at the city as it was being destroyed, and she was instantly turned into a pillar of salt. And um, Abraham and Lot, they had to leave the city and they could not look back. And so this destruction, this horrific act, it was enshrined in the Bible. And despite the fact that we have these lessons recorded for humans, we continue to repeat the same mistakes. The original sin of Sodom and Gomorrah took place at around 1700 BC, so 1700 years before Christ. But yet, in 79 AD, another biblical judgment day came to pass on the people of Pompeii in Rome. Mount Vesuvius, and this is for those who don't know about what happened in Pompeii. Mount Vesuvius erupted in a volcanic, ash, and it buried the residents of Pompeii in fire, brimstone, and again, volcanic ash kind of buried them and fossilized them essentially. Scholars from the Biblical Archaeology Institute, not the Institute, the Biblical Archaeology Society, they speculate that this natural disaster was a biblical retaliation from God against the Romans, because at that time the Romans, they treated God's chosen people, the Israelites, and they took part of they took all of Jerusalem really, and took a lot of the Israelites into Roman society, but they treated them very, very badly. So in a sense, the Romans took God's chosen people and mistreated them in the same way that we've seen Egypt also mistreat God's chosen people and face retribution for that as well. The reason Pompeii is very interesting, though, is because here I have an image that I would like to show. So here is an inscription that was carbon dated from 79 AD. The following image was from specifically a building in the Jewish community of Pompeii at around 79 AD. And the words Sodom and Gomorrah are inscribed here. It's a bit difficult to see in Latin. And this, apart from obviously the biblical connections that we can see, connecting the fire and brimstone, this the same form of destruction that happened in Sodom and Gomorrah happened to Pompeii. We also see a direct uh, connection in archaeological evidence of Sodom and Gomorrah's downfall being linked to the sin and the hubris and the destruction that we see in Pompeii. And this all makes sense because if you look, and this is very brief, and I apologize for this, but one connection from this is kind of a connection from Paschal sin to Pompeii in 79 AD. So this is after Christ. But you should also consider, the sin of hubris. This is the sin of Sodom, the sin of being, the mistake of being proud of doing something wrong. That's a terrible thing. And Roman society was guilty of it because, in general, the way that Roman society Hellenized the gods of the Greek pantheon, they Hellenized them, they appropriated them in ways that were generally, brutally violent, sexually pervasive. They gorged and they very much loved glory and honor, and all of that derived from pure debauchery in a sense. And again, the punishment for these sins, God makes it clear, holy retribution. That was the consequence of these sins. Um, another example, though, this one is more metaphorical, is the following image. It's from a political cartoon in 1907. So I'm actually going to remove that and place this image. So this is a political cartoon from 1907 in the United States. And this is amidst an economic crash that plagued the United States. The reason for the economic panic was because the owners of certain companies in Wall Street, they took part in illegal trading schemes in the stock market. And as a consequence of their mismanagement, they essentially took down the entire national economy in the years preceding 1907. The banker class lost many of the economic benefits they once enjoyed in the United States due to mounting regulation from the government, which it's portrayed here as, with the same type of imagery as Pompeii. You have a large volcanic entity dropping volcanic ash onto the banker class, and they run into a Roman-esque style building with the words "common honesty" written on the volcanic ash. So very uh, very biblical, I would say. Um, and this is a bit more of a metaphorical case, but the same principles are here. The same type of biblical punishment is used in the imagery, and the same type of connection to Pompeii is also shown here, which has already been shown to have a biblical connection through the archaeological evidence. The banking class in 1907, specifically, and this is connecting it to the sin of Sodom, the sin of hubris. The banking class in 1907 committed various human rights violations against the working class laborers, people that worked in their factories, and they did so with a flagrant disregard for their well-being and their own moral well-being as well by doing this. So, like all overtly sinful things in the world, they didn't last because God's will in the end always brings down his judgment. Now, all of these examples, um, they're very overarching, very overwhelming, yet they're interesting examples of incredible sin and incredible consequence. For our personal lives, this pattern of heavenly retribution is something that we should understand deeply, to hold a greater respect for God's true power. The promises we make with God and that God makes with us should be respected, and this recognition should allow us to understand the awesome embrace that God offers us. But we should also respect the dominion that God has over all the earth. We should let our actions be guided by Him so that we may not fall into grave sin. And if that is the motivation that you need to set certain things in your life straight, then I hope it works. God bless.